So this is one of those newsreels that they would have been playing before the main feature in World War II. Got another couple of clips that I'll show you as well from that period.
Powerful, hard-hitting, yet easily moved by the crew and strong into action in a hurry. The engineers start out for a field problem. In this case, the river crossing. That's why they use the amphibious jeep. They travel in water as well as on the land. And the ordinary jeep, which can do almost anything but swim. There's a tradition of the Army engineers that they are the first to arrive and the last to leave any scene of battle. And the combat team has its own unit of engineers. Now there's one of the amphibious jeeps in the water. The men are on a reconnaissance mission to study the river, the speed of the current, the depth of the water, and to locate a spot on the opposite side where an anchor can be established. The reconnaissance crew returns now with its data gathered in a hurry thanks to the equipment they had available to use. They make their report. The crews are already organized. The orders are given. And now watch these boys go into action. There's no time wasted and no lost motion. Stakes and ropes were set to the anchor on the near shore. But it's taken some training for them to know just which stakes and which ropes go together, and where, and why. A rubber boat carries the detail across the river to establish an anchor for the bridge on the opposite shore. Even for a simple bridge, it takes some good engineering and some husky manpower. The pieces for the pontoon units were brought by truck, and the detail unloads them in position where another detail can assemble them quickly. That takes planning, organization, training. Pieces assembled, it goes into the water, and section by section, the bridge goes across the river, one and another and then another. The men work only in the shallows near the shore, and the bridge floats over the deeper channel. The sections lag firmly to make a sturdy crossing. In only a few minutes, it reaches the opposite shore. And when it's done, the fighting engineers take up the rifles and cross to hold the bridge head. Oh, the double quick is too slow for these boys. They move at a dead run. Up the hill, exploring through the woodland. If they ever have occasion to fight in jungles, they'll be ready for it as a result of their training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The officer receiving the message here is one of the highest-ranking Nephi officers in the combat team. He's a captain, commanding officer of the engineers. He's a good engineer and a good soldier. Just in case the enemy could counterattack, it's the engineer's job to help stop them. One way to stop a tank attack is to drop trees in the tank, and the quickest way to drop a tree is to blast it down, as these engineers are doing, using a belt of TNT around the trunk, under the instruction of a knee-phase sergeant. And then a wire to connect with the detonator, one for the money, and down the tree. It's important to know how to destroy a roadway that the enemy might want to use. And the engineers cut a charge of dynamite, a big charge. Then they withdraw some distance and group around the instructor. Watch the man at the instructor's feet. He sets off the charge. Ready? And there goes. Another means of slowing down the enemy. And now, down in the crater for a close view of what the explosion did. And that's the way it happened. While some of their mates provide machine gun protection, the engineers use old-fashioned shovels and modern pneumatic equipment to dig a trench. And then the obstacle course, over the poles, down into the big ditch and up on the opposite side. If anything gets in the way, jump over it, or go under it, but don't slacken speed through a long tunnel. Up! That's a helmet, not a steel one. But he'll keep his head down after this, because that log might just as well have been a bullet. Up and over in one jump and woe under the man who lands in the middle. Full speed ahead of the crouching run. This is recommended for the waistline. And then the 8-foot wall. Over. We almost didn't make that one. Down onto the opposite side and on to the next obstacle. They fly through the air with the greatest of ease, and then down flat like well-trained turtles. only in a great big hurry. Now up and on to the finish line. That's the obstacle course. What?
No CGI there. So that was a newsreel, circa 1944. It tells you, or it puts you in the context of World War II. And that little newsreel there was developed by the War Relocation Authority, the WRA, which was established in 1942 to relocate over 120,000 AJAs. You're going to hear me say that a lot. Americans of Japanese ancestry. Not Japanese Americans. Americans first, of Japanese ancestry. And ironically, the WRA was established to relocate 120,000. And then a couple of years later, it was put in charge of putting together these newsreels to counter Imperial Japanese propaganda, accusing America of racism. I'm Nathan Watanabe, retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army. I'm wearing Lieutenant to get into the context of World War II. Most Nisei, AJAs, second generation, I'll get on that, didn't get much higher than the rank of captain in the war. Most of them started off as enlisted. There are many battlefield commissions, and I'll even touch on that as a little bit. So I'm going to talk about the 100th Full 42nd Regimental Combat Team. Kind of keeping in with our theme, if you look in Building 5, the Colorado Military Historical Group, CMHG, we're putting on a display 250 years of Army history. April 19, 1775, the shot heard around the world. June of that year, 1775, June 14th, the Army was established. One footnote in the history of the Army is the 100th Full 42, the most highly decorated unit in the United States Army of its size. And I'll touch on that as well. My linkage, I grew up in Hawaii. So if a little bit of pidgin English comes out and you don't understand, let me know, because I've been living up here in the mainland for a long time. I'm fourth generation. So my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather on my father's side was the first one to come over from Japan in about 1905 time frame, fourth generation. Here we're talking about the second generation. My father was too young to serve in World War II. He was a teenager, but we had cousins who served in this unit. One of them was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Unfortunately, it was posthumous. And it just tells a unique story, not just about AJAs and the Japanese in America, but really about the Army itself. And that's what I want to cover. There's my outline. To set the context for the 100 Full 42, I'm going to talk just a little bit about Japanese in America, and then AJAs. We'll talk about the unit, what it does in combat, and then just highlight a little bit of other AJA service. Being here from Kansas and into Nebraska, you may have heard about Ben Kuroki, who was an AJA gunner on a B-17 and later B-29, who served. Not going to the concentration camp. Background of Japanese in America. This goes all the way back to the 1400s. There are documented cases of what we thought might have been Japanese in North America at the time, but really probably just, stranded fishermen or what have you. And again, oral records being oral records, they may not have been Japanese, they may have been Chinese, they may have been whatever, but they were Asian and not Native American. But they, ones or twos, they made it over here. But what we're really focusing on are the Japanese in America. A little bit of Japanese language history here. Does anybody know how to count in Japanese? Ichi, ni, san, shi. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ich, ni, san, shi. So when we talk about Japanese generations in America, or really Japanese generations removed out of Japan, Ichi, Ise, first generation, is the generation that first leaves Japan. So they are immigrants. Ni, 2, second generation. Second generation are the ones born outside of Japan. So according to our birthright in the United States of America, that second generation, Nisei, born in America, are Americans of Japanese ancestry. As I was saying, I am fourth generation, so Ichi, Ni, San, Shi. When you count in Japanese, it's Yonsei, so I'm fourth generation. But this second generation is what we're talking about. You heard it in the video there. Because they're the ones who were born. And as we look at the history of the Japanese in America, they really started coming here in the 1880s, 90s, 1900. Get settled, have kids, 1910s, 1920s. So the Nisei are 20 years old when Pearl Harbor is bombed. They are the generation, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. So first generation, second generation. Japanese start coming to the Americas after Commodore Perry forces Japan open. At the same time, the whole shogun system is being overturned, and so you've got all these out-of-work samurai. And so, after Perry opens up Japan, Japanese start emigrating out and immigrating into the United States. Ganen mono. That is the first generation, the first arrivals of Japanese in Hawaii. My wife's family can trace back to one of those 154 out-of-work samurai who are brought over to Hawaii to work in the plantations. And that just opens up the gates into Hawaii and the West Coast. Now why? Well, 1840, 1850, 1860, 1870. What's going on out here? Westward expansion. Railroads, right? And who's building the railroads? If it's Union Pacific, Central Pacific coming down, east to west, it's mostly European laborers, Irish, what have you. But coming in from the West Coast, the Central Pacific Railroad, a lot of Chinamen. Lots of Chinamen. And that's a period term. Yeah, I don't want to get racist on you, but Chinamen. And so I'm going to use some of those period terms. And so all those Chinamen are helping build the railroad, and then finally, we got too many Chinamen. And so Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. No more Chinese immigrants. But we still need, America still needs cheap labor. Okay, so let's turn to all of these out-of-work samurai. And now the Japanese start coming in, plantations in Hawaii, agriculture fields along the West Coast. And that's where my family came in. Pineapple plantations, sugar plantations in Hawaii. But before you know it, we got too many Japanese. And so by the 1922, we have the Exclusion Act. No more Japanese. And because we already have too many Japanese, which actually outnumber the Chinese, now we're passing laws. Japanese and Chinese cannot own land. Issei, that first generation, you cannot naturalize to become an American. So is that racism? Maybe. But all these things are building up. Now, as I mentioned, we had more Japanese in the United States and Hawaii than we had Chinamen. When they first came over, they signed contracts. They were not slave labor, they were not illegals, they were bona fide immigrants. And the plan was come in, work for 5, 6, 7 years, and go back home with a bag of money. But they're working on the plantations, and they might get paid $5 a month. But they have to buy everything, from work clothes to food, from the country store. And so your bill at the end of a month might be $7. So you're $2 in debt. And so at the end of their indentured servitude, their contract labor, they don't have money to go home. And so these Japanese really become Japanese Americans, part of our country. In Hawaii, through the 1920s and 1930s, 1940s, they become a large part of the high rank, the Hawaii Army National Guard. There's 2 regiments, each one about 4,000, 5,000 soldiers in Hawaii, the 298th and 299th Infantry. And they end up making up about 40% of the Hawaii Army National Guard into the 1940s. All that to say that as the gates open for Japanese to come to America, from the late 1800s to the early and now mid-1900s, little bit of prejudice, little bit of simmering racism. as you can see in those alien land laws and the bars on citizenship. But all that, if it was simmering, comes to a boil on Pearl Harbor Day, 7 December 1941. I'm going to quote Dan Inouye, if you know who that is. He was one of the veterans of the 442nd Regiment. He was a senator from Hawaii, and at the time he passed away, he was a Senate pro tem, the third most powerful person in the United States government. On 7 December, he was in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps at the University of Hawaii. And he saw the Zeros and the Cape Bombers bombing on Pearl Harbor. He is a Nisei, and yet he shook his fist and says, "Those damn Japs!" They bombed Pearl Harbor. And that is when we entered World War II. But immediately, because of that, all AJAs, like Dan Inouye, Americans born in America, but of Japanese ancestry, were categorized draft category 4C. There's a lot of different draft categories. Category 1A, you are fit to fight. You're going to go pick up a rifle, get trained, and go to combat. Or maybe Air Corps, Marines, Navy, what have you. Category 2B, you are fit to fight, but you might be in medical school, or you might be in a critical labor position of building propellers for ships. You have an exemption. But immediately, Category 4C, ineligible for military service due to ancestry. I don't know how many times that category was used in our history, but immediately, all AJAs are branded that. And so what happens to those 1,500 soldiers in the Hawaii Army National Guard who look like me? Holy moly. 7 December, they're activated. The 24th Division, the 25th Division, United States Army Hawaii, they're activated. They head down to the beaches. They are defending because we don't know if the Japs are just going to bomb Pearl Harbor or if they're going to invade. And so they're on duty defending the Hawaiian Islands. But that's going to raise issues. Others, like Dan Inouye, ROTC, the ROTC was immediately disbanded. But these AJAs want to serve. And so they formed the Hawaii Territorial Guard, kind of a civil guard force. And they are going to augment the National Guard and the active duty soldiers. And then it's going to strike Army leadership in Hawaii. Holy moly. We got Japs protecting our beaches against Japs who may invade. Wait, no, they're not Japs. They're Americans of Japanese ancestry. But still, that doesn't matter. Because as Roosevelt issues his executive order, a lot of leaders will say, a Jap's a Jap. You cannot sort the goats from the sheep. And so, Hawaii Army National Guard, Hawaii Territorial Guard, they are pulled off the beaches. Those Hawaii Guardsmen are sent to Schofield Barracks in the center of the island and basically put in prison camp. Not really in prison, but it's barbed wire, turn in your rifles, stand by. Holy moly. In response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the President, FDR, issues Executive Order 9066, which basically says, holy moly, we need to relocate all these Japanese from the West Coast states, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California. We're facing an emergency. We need to get them out of the blast zone. They may commit, sabotage, what have you. So the War Relocation Authority, WRA, is established to manage that. And it ultimately relocates over 120,000 Japanese and AJAs from the coastal states. Only the coastal states. Like I was mentioning, Ben Kuroki is a Nebraskan, but he's already in the Army Air Force. So he's okay. But if he was a Nisei or an Issei from Chicago, Atlanta, New York, they were not relocated. It's only the Pacific states. And ultimately, almost 4,000 will be relocated from Hawaii as well. Why did they move them all out of Hawaii? The population of Hawaii in December of 1941 is almost 40% Japanese and Japanese American, AJA. And so if 40% of the population was incarcerated, the Hawaii economy would have ground to a halt. So there was no way they could have done that. So they only ended up incarcerating or shipping out 4,000, mainly Buddhist leaders, leaders of Japanese civics groups, that sort of thing. That relocation, that is a scan of a poster that would have been put up anywhere along the West Coast. I try and put myself in this context. Having served in uniform for 28 years, actually 32 years, and I'm American, and all of a sudden I'm told, hey, this is Saturday, you have until next Friday to report to this location with only what you can carry in 2 bags. All throughout Washington, Oregon, California, even parts of Arizona and Alaska. Executive Order 9066, signed by Roosevelt, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, all behind that. We are facing an emergency. We don't want to risk sabotage. Senator Rankin out of Mississippi, John L. DeWitt, commander of Army forces on the West Coast. He's the one who said, I don't care, a Jap's a Jap. Get them out of there. And so, 120,000 Japanese citizens and American citizens are moved off the West Coast to ultimately 10 relocation centers. Now picture this. This is Saturday. You have until Friday to report. You report with your 2 bags. You get on a bus. Before you end up at one of these 10 sites, you're going to spend about 3 or 4 months in a horse stable, because these camps aren't even built yet. The War Relocation Authority is trying to figure this out. For 6 months, you are cleaning stalls and then moving in. Sometimes a family of 6 or 8 would be in a stall no bigger than this room. Probably half the size of this room. And then they're moved out. And if you notice where these locations are, it's on my bucket list to try and visit as many of these as possible. I've been to Amache, Grenada, Colorado. That's not much there now. Imagine 60, 70 years ago. Not much then, 80 years ago. Not much then there. Hart Mountain, I'm going to go there this summer. These are some of the most podunk places in the United States. Very, very much of nothing. Here's a picture of Hart Mountain in Wyoming. Your standard barracks made of tar paper, what have you. 120,000 folks relocated. But America was facing an emergency. So that kind of sets the context for those AJAs and Issei and Nisei in the mainland. Flashback to Hawaii. Remember the 298th, 299th Infantry of the Hawaii Army National Guard. That's about 1,500 Nisei. Immediately they go to the beaches to defend against invasion. A couple weeks later, hey, report to Schofield Barracks, turn in your weapon. What do we do with those 1,200 soldiers? The Army is facing an emergency. We don't know if they're totally loyal, so let's just get them out of the way. And so those 1,200 soldiers are redesignated the Hawaii Provisional Battalion and shipped off to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Wait, Camp McCoy? En route, 1942, 20 June, they are redesignated the 100th Battalion. Now that's significant because in this time frame, all our standard infantry battalions are numbered 1, 2, 3. 1st Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion of a whatever regiment, of a higher unit. But 100 shows that it is a separate unit. And a battalion at this time is only about 800 soldiers. But the 100th is made up of all the Nisei in Hawaii Army National Guard. So that's almost 1,200. A little bit of language lesson again, too, now. Pidgin English in Hawaii is a mishmash of English, Japanese, Chinese, Hawaiian, Portuguese, Filipino. And en route, as the Hawaii Provisional Battalion, HPB, is redesignated the 100th, they turn to the Pidgin English and call it the one puka puka. Why? Because in Pidgin English, in Hawaiian, a puka is a hole. One hole, one puka puka. And so the Hawaii boys, there's my pigeon coming up. They call themselves the one puka puka, right? I'll say, all right. They arrive in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and then they're put back through individual and basic training. And it's like, wait a minute. These guys were, 1, older than your average soldier, and 2, because of that, more experience, and 2, they've already been through this training. And so they're going through basic training again, and of course, they're going to do very, very well. It's like a retest on something you already passed. And so because of that, the Army is very, very impressed. All these older soldiers whose GCT score, the ground combat test score, is like the average is like 8 points lower or below that needed to be an officer. Why? Because these folks are in their mid-20s. They're National Guardsmen. They have real jobs. A lot of more instructors, teachers, what have you. So it's a high level of performance, high level of knowledge. They go through initial training again in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and then in January of 43, so only a few months later, they're moved down to Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Or if you remember that walk-in video, that was filmed mostly in Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They're doing very, very well in training. So well that that is going to lend an argument for the Army to form a whole regiment based on their progress. And oh, by the way now, by January of 43, Imperial Japan is going to say, look at you Americans. You are so racist. You're imprisoning all your Japanese American citizens. No, Americans of Japanese ancestry. And so to counter that Imperial Japanese propaganda, we're going to kind of create our own propaganda. We're going to form a regiment made of AJAs. It is established 22 January 43. John J. McCloy, Chief of Staff of the Army, Marshall, George C. Marshall, he says, hey, that's a great idea. Delos C. Emmons, he is the Army commander of Hawaii, and he said, hey, those Buddha heads, and I'll get to on that later, the Japanese, the AJAs from Hawaii, did a great job. And so all these guys are behind establishing an AJA regiment, and they ultimately convince Roosevelt to authorize it. It's going to be stood up at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and that's going to bring together Buddha heads and Katongs. A little bit on that. As I mentioned, Japanese in America. A lot of them in Hawaii, a lot of them along the West Coast, and then sprinkled eastward. Those brought up in Hawaii were brought in to work on the plantations. A little bit different mindset. Working on a plantation than, say, working in Chicago. And so that's going to draw friction. Buddha heads and Katongs. Buddha heads. I'm a Buddha head. Born and raised in Hawaii. Now, I've been to college. I got education. But generally back then, the Buddha heads were picking pineapples, chopping sugar cane. And so that's going to help, that's going to shape how they grow up. And to the more refined AJAs living up here in the mainland, who are more refined, fitting in with, you white people, who are very refined, these country bumpkins are kind of like pigs. Buta. Japanese for buta, or pig, is buta. They have no manners. Pig heads, buta heads. An alternate explanation for that term is, if you saw me in my basic training haircut with no hair, I look something like Buddha. Okay. So, regardless, the AJAs from the mainland took to calling the AJAs from Hawaii either Buddha head or Buddha head. Now, if I was called a Buddha head by someone from up here who speaks very good English and is very, very reserved because they're in the minority. In Hawaii, those plantation workers are part of the majority. So they're more egregious, they're more outgoing. But to those from the mainland, they're kind of stuck up. And so it led to a lot of fisticuffs, a lot of fighting. And of course, who's going to win? Country mouse, city mouse? Country mouse, right? And so knocking their heads together sound like knocking coconuts. So we're going wrong. Katong, katong, katong. Now that's funny, but as both Danny Noy and George Sakato, both Medal of Honor recipients, George Sakato actually lived in, finally passed away in Denver. It got so bad that the Army almost shut down this experiment until the Buddha heads visited one of the internment centers in Rower, Arkansas, and they saw what the Katongs went through. Their rights stripped away, imprisoned. Then they became more conciliatory, and then the unit really took off. So back to the history of the unit. So you have a mix of Hawaiians, Buddhaheads, and Katonks, those from the mainland. And as I mentioned, once they visited the camps at Rower and Jerome, a lot of aloha, a lot of compassion flowed, and the groups really bonded. Now, there were a couple of distractions. As the battalion, 100 Battalion, is finishing up training, getting ready to ship over, and the regiment is building up, the Army took some recruits for the MIS, Military Intelligence Service, because we're fighting the Japs in the Pacific. And who better to interpret than Japanese speakers? So a lot of the, not a lot, but members of the 442 were recruited into the Military Intelligence Service, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. And here's an interesting aside. About a platoon, over a platoon, about 50 to 60 soldiers were pulled from the regiment to go support an experiment down Cat Island, Mississippi. Cat Island is one of those barrier reef islands off Mississippi. The theory was Japanese smell different than Americans. So maybe we could train war dogs to go sniff out Japanese. It didn't work. Because people smell like what you eat, right? And these AJAs are eating American food, so they smell like Americans. As a point, when I was stationed in Korea, I'm an American. I'm eating, and my Korean soldiers would always say, "You Americans smell like cheese." Whatever. You guys smell like kimchi. I mean, that's just fact. But I actually spoke to one of these veterans, and he said, "Yeah, it was totally off base, but they had a good time fishing on those islands anyway." So, I mean, what's the Army thinking, right? What's the Army thinking? Now, when I talk about a regiment, the 100 Full 42nd Regimental Combat Team composed of about 4,500 soldiers. The regiment is commanded by a colonel, a full bird. I'm only dressed as a lieutenant. My retired rank was a lieutenant colonel, but there were no Nisei lieutenant colonels. So to get in this context, I'm just a butterbar. So you have a colonel commanding this entire regiment. The X is the infantry regiment. Headquarters. The main combat power of this regiment are 3 battalions. And as I mentioned before, 1st Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion. But as this regiment matures, the 1st Battalion will go away. It's going to become filler and replacements for the 100th Battalion. Because the 100th Battalion goes to fight first in late 43, and then the 442 follows. While the 100th is fighting, they're going to take so many casualties that the 1st Battalion is going to provide replacements, and then when the regiment catches up, the 100th Battalion will become the 1st Battalion. Each of these battalions get about 800 soldiers or so. Now, it's a regimental combat team because, unlike a regular infantry regiment, which only has infantrymen with rifles and machine guns, this combat team has artillery, think cannons, anti-tank company with anti-tank guns, bazookas, special kinds of cannon, engineers, as you saw in that video, another bigger cannon unit, service company, first aid or medical platoon, and then even its own band. Again, altogether about 4,500. Now, at any given time, it's authorized 4,500. But if you get one wounded, you get another replacement. And so by the end of the war, almost 10,000 will have served in this regiment. And where do they serve? Italy. The 100th Battalion will start off in Italy at Salerno, Cassino, and then Rome. When did we take Rome? In World War II. I'm sorry. When did we liberate Rome in World War II? General Mark Clark was commanding U.S. forces in Italy. And you know, all these generals back then, big egos. He liberated Rome on the 4th of June, 1944. He's going to be in the headlines, right? For all of 2 days. Because what happens 2 days later? D-Day. And all attention turns up to there. But after Rome, the regiment will participate in Operation Dragoon in southern France. After Dragoon, the regiment will actually make it all the way up France to the Rhineland on the doorstep of Germany. Following there, and that is the episode of the Lost Battalion. I'm going to dive into that little episode for just a little bit. They take so many hits, so many losses, that your regiment is moved back down to recover in what they would call the Champagne campaign. And then the regiment finally ends up in Italy, where it started, in the Apennines and then Po Valley. So that's an overview of what the 100th and later the 100th 442 did in combat. There were some units, like the artillery battalion, that actually stayed up in northern France and supported no less than 10 other units firing artillery in support of those units. One series or battles that I want to point out that highlight. As I mentioned, the 100th Battalion went in early, late 43. They were attached to the 34th Division, took so many hits that the 1st Battalion had to refill them with replacements. A few months later, the 442 Regiment caught up, and then the 100th was made part of the 442. And so that is where they became the 100/442nd Regimental Combat Team. They fought their way up Italy, but probably their toughest fight was here in France, part of Operation Dragoon. Now, Operation Dragoon. God bless the British. They were standing alone since 1940. And it wasn't until 1944 that we came to their aid, and the French, and started to liberate the continent. If you all remember D-Day, if you're all familiar with D-Day, that took place up here. Now, the big plan to push the Germans out of Europe and France was to have a two-pincher movement. D-Day here, Operation Hammer, and then Operation Anvil come up here at the same time. So you have a pincer movement. Unfortunately, Operation Hammer, Operation Anvil, the name Anvil was compromised. And so Operation Anvil became Operation Dragoon. Operation Hammer became Operation Neptune, or D-Day. But we did not have enough logistics. We did not have enough stuff to do them at the same time. We wanted to do them at the same time, but we didn't have enough landing craft. And so D-Day went down on 6 June 1944. Once we got established, we could bring all those logistics way back down here past Spain, what have you, and then launch Operation Dragoon 3 months later in August. So Eisenhower is fighting his way through northern France. Operation Dragoon, the plan is to land in and around Marseille, push up the Rhone Valley, turn right, hit Strasbourg into Germany. Now, why go all that way? What's here? Switzerland. And two things about Switzerland. They're neutral, so we can't really go into Switzerland. And what else is Switzerland known for, other than chocolate? The Alps. So it's like, hey, that is not an option. So we have to go all the way up here. This is the big picture. Because this invasion occurred in June, now all the Germans are running up to this way. And so once we land in Marseille vicinity in August, we have very little resistance, and the advance goes fairly quick. 15 August, by 10 days later, by the end of the month, beginning of September, by the end of the first week of September, we're almost on the doorstep of Germany. Now, at this time, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team is attached to the 36th Infantry Division, T-Patchers, under Major General John E. Dahlquist. Now, everybody knows Patton, right? Patton, I want to be the first in Germany. I think every general above 2 stars wanted to be the first in Germany. Wanted to be the first in Germany. Dahlquist was no exception. He wanted to be the first one to shoot the gap and be into Germany. And so he is pushing the 36th Division hard. But here's the problem. He's going to run into terrain and fanatical Germans. At this time, August of 44, you know, the Germans tried to kill Hitler. Hitler's very, very paranoid, and he issues what's called Befehls. Do or die. Defend. No Westerner, no non-German is going to be in Germany at the cost of death. And so there are fanatical Germans defending in this region. That small little red square is this area. And this is just one of the highlights, one of the big battles that the 442 took part in. But it really illustrates the Gulf nature of this unit. Gulf, why? Because half of them came from concentration camps. Their citizenship was put in doubt. They had nothing to lose. So they're going to shoot the works. They're going to go for broke. The Lost Battalion. So the 36th Division, General Dahlquist. Remember that big arrow? He's coming up. Now we need to hit Sandy, which is 4 kilometers about here off the map. That will push or open the gap into Germany. Now if you look at this map, all this green is that thick vegetation. And if you've been to this part of Europe, France, Germany, generally they have burgermeisters who very, very carefully manage the forests. But this war has been going on for almost 10 years, and so all this forest is not managed. It's very, very thick, very, very overgrown. So it's hard to move, hard to see. Think of the stress. You're patrolling through this terrain. You don't know if a Jerry or Kraut is behind that tree 10 yards, 100 yards from you. Second, it's October. It's cold. And by all accounts, this is the worst winter in Europe in 20 years, since World War I. And so, General Dahlquist, 36th Division, he's going to push up, and it's all about the roads, because you can't really travel through these mountains because of the woods and the terrain, very, very hilly. So you've got to secure the roads, and then move up the roads. But to secure the roads, you have to secure the high ground. And so, Dahlquist puts the 1st Battalion of the 141st Regiment to clear this high ground in the Vosges Forest, the Forêt de Miel de Champs, to secure the high ground above Le Housier and Beaufontaine. But because, and if you look at these terrain features, it's a very, very narrow ridge. Normally, we as soldiers like to move out, 1 up, 2 back. 1 battalion out front, 1 to either side, so that if he hits the enemy, we can swing around a battalion that way or a battalion this way. But we can't do that in this terrain. And so what actually happens, 1st Battalion is strung out. A company behind a company behind a company. And worse, that company is not a platoon, a platoon, a platoon. It's a platoon behind a platoon behind a platoon. Awesome, if you're a German. Because what does that do for the Germans? All they have to do is hit them in the front, and they stop. Now the objective is to clear this whole ridgeline, and notice these squares. Each one is a kilometer, about half a mile, a click. And so it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 clicks, 4 miles. No problem. Yeah, right. But that elevation, that terrain, and what the Germans do is they're going to cut them off. Because they have no flanking depth. It's all ducks in a row. And so they're easily cut off. And so ultimately, 187, almost 2 companies up, minus of a battalion, is cut off short of the objective. Holy moly, what are we going to do? So elements of 2 companies, and that now becomes the Lost Battalion. Now Dahlquist, 2-star Eagle, and he actually ends his career as a 4-star general, so I guess it worked. But he's pushing, pushing, pushing. Now the 2 other regiments of the 36th, the 142nd and 143rd, are going to push forward, try and rescue that battalion. Yeah, okay, for a day or 2. While this is happening, the 442 is down in this area. And actually that is where my father's cousin got killed about a week before this episode. in, I want to say Bruyères. So the 442 is still fighting, attached to the 36. The 141st gets cut off. Dahlquist says, oh my gosh, there goes my career. I'm going to lose a battalion. 142nd, 143rd Regiment, go get them. Okay, got it. They don't really move out because all the way since Italy, the division has kind of learned about this guy's ego. So a little bit of lackluster. And so coming straight out of the battle, down here in Bruyères, Dahlquist says, 442, go rescue them at all costs. 187 soldiers. Some of the veterans I spoke to were two of them, who were actually three, who had been through this battle, said as they were moving forward from this area past the 143rd and 142nd, they were just sitting under trees smoking, waiting for the 442 to take over because they didn't trust this general. Now, on the 442 side, the Buddhaheads and Katonks either had one of two opinions. Many of them said, yeah, Dahlquist called us and said, go for broke, because we only Buddhaheads. We're fodder, we're cannon fodder, he don't care. But just as many veterans said, no, he called us because he knew we could get the job done. And so, the fight begins 25th of October 1944 to rescue the lost battalion. The 442 is arrayed with the 2nd Battalion to the north, and that's going to clear or secure the high ground to the north. The 3rd and the 100th Battalion are going to follow the route of the lost battalion to try and make contact. Now what we don't know, so that's the plan of attack. What we don't know at this time is the disposition of the enemy. And it's going to be as such. These are outposts. Now in our day, outposts, 3-4 men. The Germans, through the Vosges Mountains, their outposts are 25 to 30 men with machine guns, hand grenades, submachine guns, bazooka, or German equivalent of bazookas and anti-tank guns. And then there's also strong points with big barricades. And that's what our Buddhaheads are facing as they're crawling through that thick terrain. Normally, an advance would be about 1 kilometer an hour. Here, they're making advances about a 1 kilometer per day. It's terrible conditions. It's cold. You don't know where the Germans are. And then the Germans start launching artillery. And if you remember those pictures of the train in the woods, tree bursts. The artillery shells land and explode in the trees. Instead of exploding and blowing up, they blow down. So it's very, very tough conditions. And so it's very, very slow going. By the 25th, the attack kicks off. 26th, 27th, again, only about 1,000 yards a day. By the 28th, 29th, they're just on the verge, and by the 30th, the 3rd Battalion makes contact with the lost battalion. To rescue 187 start, actually I think it was more like 150 made it out. The Buddhaheads lost over 300. Lost, killed, and wounded. Some accounts will say they lost over 800, but that's not correct. The brigade, the regiment, the 442, over 800 killed and wounded through the month of October. But breaking it down in this 4-day period, they lost over almost 300. But that's not good enough. Once the lost battalion is rescued, the 442 is directed to continue their mission and secure the high ground. So by the end of October, the 103rd Battalion are overlooking La Housière. But it is actually a good news story.
A barrage of food and medicine, carefully loaded into 150
some of the terrain, some of the foliage, vegetation.
Composed of American citizens of Japanese ancestry, moves up to rescue the lost battalion of World War II. Here, over tough terrain in the Vosges forests of France, they advance in the face of strong enemy resistance.
Notice the cameraman is only taking pictures going downhill because he's got that big camera.
Lost
Not going up.
battalion gets supplies. Rescued at last after 6 days under incessant fire from an enemy on all sides, the 141st Regiment comes back. These men were without food or medicine for 4 days. They find there's nothing so good as field rations or a cigarette. Signal Corps pictures show trucks and jeeps to carry back the wounded and exhausted. The Yanks of the lost battalion no longer are bound for the rear. Ahead for every man is a well-deserved breathing spell from the long, bitter battle of the Western Front.
A little bit of propaganda, but it serves its purpose. Hey, those AJAs, they're actually doing some good. So imagine seeing that before you go and watch Daffy Duck in Disneyland in the theaters in 1945. So the Lost Battalion, just one of many fights, the rescue of the Lost Battalion, I should say, in 1944. To rescue those remnants, about 150 of that battalion, over 300 casualties. Cumulative through October and back into September and August, the regiment was depleted. And so fighting these conditions, thick vegetation, very, very cold, nasty conditions, the regiment made it through. There's General Dahlquist. One of the veterans I spoke with was Lieutenant Colonel Young Ok Kim. Kim, wait, that's not Japanese. He was Korean. When he reported into the 442 in 43, in Camp Shelby, he reported into the regimental commander and said, Colonel Pence, Lieutenant Kim, reporting for duty. Kim, hold on. I'll arrange your transfer immediately. It's like, why? Well, you're Korean. This is a Japanese-American unit. Koreans and Japanese don't get along. And he said, Colonel Kim said, sir, I don't care. I'm an American. And every veteran that I interviewed who knew Kim loved him. I got so many more stories, but we don't have time. But Colonel Kim pointed out, you see that picture? That's Dahlquist. That's his staff. Notice they're not standing shoulder to shoulder with him. No, 100% of veterans I knew did not like this guy. Because whether it was fodder or what have you. But he was grateful for the 442 for rescuing that battalion and his career. By mid-November, he says, Colonel Pence, the regimental commander, I want to honor your soldiers. I want a formation. I want your entire regiment out. So he comes out. Colonel Pence is out there. And remember now, this regiment has lost 800 just through October. Over a couple of thousand over the last few. General Dahlquist, he's pissed. And he says, Colonel Pence, knife hand now, I wanted your entire regiment here. Some of the companies are down to 4 guys. Companies, normally 150 to 200 soldiers. And Pence almost breaks into tears. And so I'm getting a little choppy because both Mr. Sakato, and I'll talk about him, and Danny Noy relayed this to me. And it's also well documented in some books. And Pence almost broke down and said, sir, that is the entire regiment. But they made it through. But because of those losses, the 442 was moved out from this area down to Nice and the Riviera. They had to recover. And if that regiment is made up of folks who look like me, you're only going to get replacements from 2 places. The new incoming recruits from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, or the Buddha heads and Katongs coming out of the hospital. And so from November, December into January, they're here on the Riviera what the veterans would call the Champagne Campaign. They're doing patrols, but they're really rebuilding. And on a side story, they actually capture a German one-man submarine. It's floating around in the harbor there at Nice. They shoot some mortars. It goes cockeyed. Few guys swim out and capture a German submarine, one-man submarine. But that's short-lived. By January of 1945, we need to get them back on the line. The artillery battalion is detached from the regiment, and they end the war in Northern Europe, supporting the 4th Infantry Division, the 101st Division, what have you. The rest of the regiment will finish the war in Italy, so not too far away. One, Italy needs soldiers, that theater. And two, it was thought that, hey, these Buddha heads, being from Hawaii, the warmer weather in Italy versus Northern Europe would suit them better. They actually ended up fighting in the Apennines and the Po Valley. Now, they're a regiment, but at this time, they are attached to that unit. What does that look like? What kind of animal is that? Buffalo. Buffalo soldiers. Harkening back to the 9th and 10th Cav, in World War II, the 92nd and the 93rd Infantry Divisions were segregated divisions, all black. Unfortunately, and this says nothing about their racial heritage, but it says something about the context of America. In 1940s, most of the blacks were still coming out of the plantations and slavery. And so they were not very well motivated or well educated. It's just a matter of context. And so the 92nd wasn't doing well. And so in Italy, what the army did was, okay, we're going to take the best soldiers and collapse from the 3 regiments and make one all-black regiment. But it's a division, so it still needs 2 other regiments. One is the 442, and then the 3rd regiment, this is 1945. We own the skies, and so we took all our anti-aircraft gunners and made them infantrymen. And so the 92nd Division was made up of one of its own regiments, the 442, and what's called flak feet, our anti-aircraft artillery, who became infantrymen. And that is where the 442 ended the war. Now, lest you think that the only AJAs serving in World War II were just with the 100 442, they were spread out throughout the war. As I mentioned before, many were recruited into the MIS. If they could speak and write Japanese proficiently, they became interpreters, translators, and the 5307 Composite Unit, Merrill's Marauders. Now that was a commando unit. It was dropped in Burma, Thailand, that area, and they were running around behind Japanese lines for about 6 or 8 months. This is a regiment, again about 5,000 soldiers, and they had a good dozen or two of Japanese AJAs, Nisei interpreters. What did they do? Well, they are questioning prisoners of war, Japanese prisoners of war. In certain instances, as they're walking through Japanese-held jungle at night, they set up a defense. And one of their interpreters crawls forward about 100, 200 yards. He hears the Japanese planning an attack. He comes back and says, "Hey, sir, the Japanese are going to attack. First thing at light." And so what the Americans do is they draw back about 50 yards. The Japanese think we're here. First light, they start charging. Bop, 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 bop. We stop them. And then that interpreter, in pure Japanese, Yamato Tamashi! Tendo Henka! Banzai! That is, long live the emperor. 10,000 years. Attack! The Japanese don't know better. They don't know whether their officers are where. And so they start attacking again, and pop, 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 pop. And we just, so I want to say about 125 U.S. soldiers take down about 500 Japanese soldiers. That's what they do. And Merrill's Marauders, that was their symbol, that was their crest, which became the basis for our 75th Ranger Regiment today. I mentioned Ben Kuroki. He was a door gunner on a B-17 at the start of the war. He did 25 missions in Europe. And then he transferred over to the Pacific and was a door gunner on the B-29. So somewhat of a minor celebrity, except and I spoke to some folks here in Nebraska. The families, the AJA families, did not like him because he was such a celebrity. It kind of energized some of the sons to go enlist into the 442. Just a couple of other notes on the MIS. As we interpreted and translated and questioned Japanese prisoners, once they realized we spoke Japanese, they opened up because they were raised under Bushido, the code of the warrior. They're supposed to die in combat. But if our translators could convince them to surrender, they just opened right up. A lot of valuable intelligence and frankly a lot of lives saved on both sides in the Pacific. PT boats. After the war, this guy, actually my dad knew this guy. Prior to World War II, 1939, 1940, 1941, Nakano. He was a spy. He posed as a Japanese businessman in Manila, and he was reporting on the Japanese movements in the Philippines. He reported straight to MacArthur. Well, unfortunately, we were defeated in the Philippines, and Douglas MacArthur was ordered to get out of the Philippines. He was ordered. We don't want our 4-star, our senior-most 4-star, captured by the Japanese. And so whether you call him Dugout Doug or what have you, he was ordered out of Corregidor via PT boat. My dad tells me the story that in about the 1945-46 time frame on Time magazine, there's a picture of Douglas MacArthur standing on the deck of that PT boat as he's leaving, or actually pulling into, I think, Port Moresby. And in the back is edited out. You can see his figure, but you can't see his face, of Nakano, who was that translator. He was such a high-placed spy that they did not want it known that he came out with MacArthur. So a lot of valuable intelligence, a lot of valuable service, not just in the 442. But back to the 442, the legacy itself. As I mentioned previously, the most highly decorated unit in the United States Army for its size, a regiment. 4,500 soldiers, over 18,000 individual awards. Unfortunately, over half of them were Purple Hearts. But for a regiment, 21 Medals of Honor. That's pretty high. As for instance, everybody's seen Band of Brothers? 506th Regiment, Parachute Infantry Regiment. That was my first unit when I joined the Army and served in Korea with 2nd Infantry Division, 506th. Established in 1942, still active today. That regiment, till today, only has 5 Medals of Honor. Through World War II, Vietnam, and the Global War on Terrorism. The 442 had 21 Medals of Honor, including Uncle Dan. 2 of their members would become congressmen, Spark Matsunaga and Danny Noy. And as I mentioned, at his passing in 2015, Danny Noy was the Senate Pro Tem, number 3 man in government. Nice guy. My dad's cousin, Masanao Otake, Distinguished Service Cross. All told, 650 killed, not counting wounded. That's the number of wounded. And 468 oak leaf clusters. So 2nd and 3rd. So over almost 10,000 wounded. 7 presidential unit citations. And today, the 442nd, the 442, is the only combat unit in the Army Reserve. Army Reserve is a federal force, but it's mostly service and support. Transportation units, what have you. The combat units are either in active duty or National Guard, but this is the only federalized. Uncle Dan, as a Senate Pro Tem, he said, no, 442 will never be National Guard. I don't think he liked the Hawaii National Guard. Another legacy. Partly because of the efficiency and success of the 442, Truman in 1948, through executive order, said, we're going to desegregate the country, but we're going to start with the DOD. 1947, the War Department became the Department of Defense. And through executive order 9981, we're going to desegregate. For Hawaii, Senator Matsunaga, Senator Inoue. A lot of the veterans used the GI Bill, went to law school, and came back to Hawaii and led to the Democratic Revolution. Right? Look at the timing. War ends in 45. It takes a year to get your GI Bill going. By 51, you are finishing college and law school. After that, boom, now they're all running for office. And up until 1954, Hawaii, being a plantation, pineapple and sugar, big business, was very, very much Republican. But now, and this is back when Democrats were good. It swings the state. God bless Uncle Dan. You know, I mean, I love him. He was a close family friend. Same with Matsunaga. But Hawaii has been Democratic ever since. And I'm not even going to go to where that Democratic is now. Not here in Kansas. Okay. And then, 1996, President Clinton says, hey, you know that Go for Broke unit? They really did a lot of good. We need to review all those records because maybe they were unduly influenced by racism. You think? And so what happens is, as part of that review, 20 Distinguished Service Crosses and that Distinguished Service Medal and Silver Stars are reviewed, and 20 of them are awarded or upgraded to Medal of Honor. Now, Dan Inoue, last time I met him was with George Sakato, and he said that, yeah, they gave me the Medal of Honor, and they didn't take away my BSc, so he had both. But it was until 1996 that that one Medal of Honor was upgraded or increased to 21 Medals of Honor. And if that's not enough legacy,
G.I. Joe, fighting man for Mexico, on the land of the sea is the air.
in the early 2000s, Hasbro, when they were still making 12-inch G.I. Joes, found it fit to make one in honor of the 100th World War II. Now, if you know anything about G.I. Joe, when it first came out in 1964, 12-inch action figure, not dolls, action figure, right? 12-inch, 1/6 scale. Being the average American soldier, about 6 foot tall, 12-inch tall, 1/6. That action figure is about 11.5 inches tall. So it's a little bit shorter. Why? Because all those Buddha heads, George Sakato, Dan Inoue, the average height in World War II was 5'2". Then, Hasbro being Hasbro, they took that same figure, dressed him out, put an armband, and he's Hawaii Territorial Guard. That was in a blister pack, so it's not really cool like that big box. And then others followed suit. So it's nothing to be immortalized in plastic. So that was the 100 World War II. So what I've done is give you a little bit of history on Americans of Japanese ancestry, of Japanese Americans, of Issei Nisei, how that fermented and formed into World War II, what World War II did, what the 100th World War II was able to accomplish in the face of those odds, and where it came out today. I'm a little bit over, but I hope you enjoyed it. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask, but I think someone is up after. Sure.
Was during Vietnam, was there a 1H classification for the draft?
I want to say yes, but I don't know all the different classifications. Ones, I mean, there were a number of ones, right? 1A is you are fit to fight, you're going to go. I want to say 2B is you are deferred for medical school, whatever. 1H might be you are ready to go, but. So I want to say yes, but I'm not sure what that was.
Yeah, I believe I had 1H, and the reason why is because when I was a senior, I graduated high school at age 17, right? And my birthday, I didn't turn 18 till 22nd September, right? So it was like in August, I think, is when they stopped the
In
draft.
73. Yeah.
In 73.
I think so, yes.
That's when I got out of college. And then, that was that.
1H. You might have been deferred because you were in school, and I think there's a 2B deferred through schooling, what have you. Matter of fact, in 1941, Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. Dan Inoue is in college at the University of Hawaii. He is studying pre-med.
Right.
And he tells a story in this book, Journey to Washington. You know, he's walking home. He sees the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, and he goes, "You damn Japs!" And he was actually deferred because he was in pre-med. But then ultimately, they rescind that deferment, and he joins the full War II.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, the last thing I'm going to point out is this is just a snapshot of World War II. This year, 2025. Anybody want to guess the significance of this year? You all know what next year is, right? 2026.
Yeah.
250 years of the country. Wow, awesome, right? Not a bicentennial, but a 250 years. So President Trump, you know, he's got some big things planned. But this year is the 250th anniversary of the United States Army. 14 June. 14 June. And so, in honor of that, when you go over to our building there, the CMHG, we've got a whole 250-year timeline of the United States Army.
That's fantastic.
All right, I'll be around, but please enjoy yourself.
Thank you. Thank you.